It was January of the year 1945. The compound stood like a scar on the frozen German landscape, ringed by barbed wire and watchtowers. Inside Stalag 9B, near Bad Orb, 1,400 American prisoners of war shivered in wooden barracks that leaked wind through every crack. The temperature hovered near zero. Rations had been cut again. Disease was spreading. And then the SS arrived. They came in 3 trucks, black uniforms stark against the snow, demanding access to the prisoner roster. They were looking for Jewish soldiers, for political undesirables, for anyone they could separate and disappear. The camp's commandant, Oberst Heinrich Geiger, met them at the gate. He was 52 years old, a career officer from the old Prussian military tradition, a man who had served in the First World War and carried scars that still ached in cold weather. He stood in front of the SS captain, arms crossed, and said 4 words that would save lives and cost him everything. "You have no authority here." The SS captain's face darkened. "We have authority everywhere." Geiger didn't move. Not in my camp. What the SS didn't know, what even most of the prisoners wouldn't learn until years later, was that Heinrich Geiger had been quietly protecting American POWs for months. Not through grand gestures or dramatic defiance, but through careful bureaucratic resistance, through deliberate incompetence, through the kind of subtle disobedience that could only come from a man who understood how systems work and exactly how to break them without being caught. He was risking his life. He was betraying his oath. And he was doing it because somewhere along the line, Heinrich Geiger had stopped believing in the war and started believing in something older: the laws of war, the Geneva Convention, the idea that even in hell some rules still mattered. The old guard. Heinrich Geiger was not born a rebel. He grew up in Bavaria, the son of a judge and a piano teacher. His childhood was structured, disciplined, built around respect for law and order. He joined the German army in 1912, served with distinction in the First World War, earned the Iron Cross in the trenches of Verdun, where he learned what modern warfare really meant. Not glory, but mud and gas and bodies stacked like cordwood. After the war, he stayed in the military. It was what he knew. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Geiger kept his head down and his mouth shut. He wasn't political. He was a soldier. He followed orders because that's what soldiers did. But by 1944, something had changed. He'd seen too much. The war was clearly lost. The ideology he'd tried to ignore had become impossible to avoid. And when he was assigned to command Stalag 9B in October 1944, he arrived at a choice: enforce the regime's increasingly brutal policies toward prisoners, or find ways to resist without getting caught. He chose resistance. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The prisoners arrived. The Americans began arriving in December 1944, captured during the Battle of the Bulge. They came in cattle cars, packed so tightly men suffocated standing up. They arrived frozen, starving, traumatized. Some had frostbite so severe their fingers turned black. Others had wounds that were infected, gangrenous, deadly. Official German policy by late 1944 was clear: feed prisoners as little as possible, provide minimal medical care, conserve resources for German troops. The regime was collapsing. Food was scarce, medicine was scarcer. POWs were expendable. But Geiger looked at these men, boys really, most of them younger than his own son who had died at Stalingrad, and made a decision. He would help them. Not obviously, not in ways that would get him shot, but through the cracks in the system, through the bureaucratic chaos of a dying regime. He started small. When Red Cross parcels arrived, they were supposed to be inspected and portions confiscated for security reasons. Geiger inspected them personally and confiscated nothing. When guards reported prisoners hoarding food, Geiger filed the reports and did nothing. When Berlin ordered reduced rations, Geiger claimed supply problems and maintained the old levels as long as he could. His adjutant, a younger officer named Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, noticed. "Herr Oberst," he said quietly one evening, "if Berlin finds out—" "Then make sure they don't find out," Geiger replied. Hoffmann stared at him, then nodded. He understood. They were committing treason together now. The medical gambit. The real crisis came with medicine. By January 1945, the camp had almost no medical supplies. Men were dying from infections that penicillin could cure, from dysentery that simple sanitation could prevent, from pneumonia that warm clothing could fight. Geiger's camp physician, Dr. Klaus Brandt, came to him desperate. "We need sulfa drugs, bandages, antibiotics. Without them, we'll lose 50 men by month's end." Geiger said, "Berlin has denied the request." "Then we steal them," Brandt replied. Geiger looked up. Brandt was serious, and he was right. Over the next 3 weeks, Geiger orchestrated a quiet theft. He approved training exercises that took guards near Wehrmacht supply depots. He authorized inventory corrections that created paper shortages requiring replacement orders. He signed requisitions with deliberately vague descriptions that allowed his supply sergeant to obtain medical materials and list them as general camp supplies. It worked. Medicine trickled into the camp. Not enough. Never enough. But enough to save lives that would otherwise have been lost. An American medic, Colonel James Peterson, later wrote in his diary, "Don't know where the German doc is getting the sulfa, but it's keeping boys alive. Either he's a saint, or someone up the chain is looking the other way." Someone was. Geiger was looking the other way on purpose. The SS arrived in January 1945 with orders to identify and segregate Jewish prisoners. This wasn't bureaucratic resistance territory. This was immediate, deadly threat. Geiger met them at the gate. The SS captain demanded the prisoner roster. Geiger said it had been damaged in an Allied bombing raid and was being reconstructed. The SS demanded to interrogate prisoners directly. Geiger said that would disrupt camp order and required authorization from Wehrmacht High Command. "You're obstructing us," the SS captain said coldly. "I'm following proper procedure." The standoff lasted 3 hours. Geiger used every bureaucratic trick he knew: jurisdictional disputes, required paperwork, chains of command, authorization protocols. He buried them in regulations. The SS captain grew frustrated, then angry. He threatened to report him to Berlin.
"Report what you like," Geiger said, "but you're not entering this camp without proper Wehrmacht authorization." The SS left. They returned 2 days later with authorization, but by then Geiger had done something extraordinary. He'd destroyed the religious identification cards for all prisoners and claimed they'd been lost in transit. Without documentation, the SS couldn't definitively identify Jewish soldiers. They tried anyway. They walked through barracks, demanding prisoners identify themselves. Most stayed silent. Some gave false information. The SS grew suspicious, but had no way to verify. After 4 days, they left with only 3 prisoners, men who'd been identified through other means. It could have been dozens. It should have been. But Geiger had protected them through the most powerful weapon he had: paperwork. The cost. Geiger's actions didn't go unnoticed forever. By February 1945, questions were being asked. Why did his camp have fewer deaths than others? Why were Red Cross supplies reaching prisoners so efficiently? Why had the SS been unable to complete their mission? An investigation was opened. Geiger was recalled to Berlin for questioning. He knew what that meant. Officers who were investigated rarely returned. Before he left, he gathered his staff. He said, "Whatever they ask you, tell them I acted alone. Tell them you followed my orders. Tell them I never explained my reasoning." Lieutenant Hoffmann spoke up. "Herr Oberst, that's an order, Werner." Geiger left the camp on February 28, 1945. The prisoners watched from behind the wire. They didn't know where he was going. Most assumed they'd never see him again. They were almost right. Geiger was interviewed for 6 days in Berlin. He admitted nothing. He claimed incompetence, supply problems, communication failures. He portrayed himself as an old soldier struggling with modern administration. They didn't believe him, but by March 1945, Germany was collapsing. The regime had bigger problems than one POW camp commandant. They sent him to the Eastern Front, a death sentence in all but name. Geiger arrived at a shattered unit retreating from Soviet forces, took command of what remained, and fought a careful withdrawal that prioritized saving his men over following suicidal orders. He survived the war by surrendering to American forces in May 1945. He spent 2 years in a POW camp himself. Irony was not lost on him. The revelation. For decades, Heinrich Geiger's story remained buried. He never spoke of it. After the war, he returned to Bavaria, worked as a clerk in a municipal office, lived quietly with his wife in a small apartment. He wanted no recognition, no attention. He'd done what he believed was right. That was enough. But in 1968, a group of American veterans began researching their POW experience. They wanted to understand why Stalag 9B had such a lower death rate than comparable camps. They began comparing records, interviewing survivors, piecing together patterns. They found Geiger. He was 75 years old, nearly deaf, living on a modest pension. They asked him, why? Why had he risked everything to protect enemy soldiers? Geiger thought for a long time. Then he said, in careful English, "Because they were not enemies. They were prisoners, and I was an officer. Officers have duties that transcend politics." He paused and added, "Also, I had a son. He died in Russia. I like to think that somewhere, maybe a Russian officer showed him kindness before the end. Maybe not, but maybe. And that was enough reason to try." The pattern behind the resistance. What Geiger did wasn't unique in concept. Many German officers showed small mercies. What made his actions extraordinary was their systematic nature. He built a structure of protection, a careful web of bureaucratic resistance that operated continuously for months. He understood that in a totalitarian system, the greatest power isn't dramatic defiance. It's the quiet manipulation of paperwork, the strategic incompetence, the art of making the wrong records disappear and the right ones appear at crucial moments.
After the war, historians studying Wehrmacht resistance movements identified Geiger's methods as textbook examples of institutional sabotage. He became a case study, taught at military academies, not as a hero, but as an example of ethical leadership under impossible circumstances. What he saved. The numbers were later calculated. During Geiger's command, Stalag 9B's death rate was approximately 4%, compared to 12 to 15% at similar camps. That difference represents roughly 140 lives. Men who went home to Kansas and Texas and New York, who had children and grandchildren who never knew how close they came to not existing. Corporal James Peterson, the medic who survived, later became a doctor. He named his son Heinrich. When asked why, he said simply, "Because someone gave me the medicine that let me come home." And his name was Heinrich. Heinrich Geiger died in 1972, age 79, in a small Bavarian town. His funeral was attended by 11 people, his wife, 3 neighbors, and 7 American veterans who flew to Germany to honor the enemy officer who saved their lives. They placed a wreath on his grave. The inscription read, "To an officer who remembered that duty runs deeper than orders." One of the veterans, now a grandfather himself, said, "He didn't stop the war. He didn't change history. He just protected some prisoners when he could have looked away. That's all. And that's everything." Because sometimes heroism isn't loud. Sometimes it's an old officer standing at a gate, arms crossed, telling the SS they have no authority here. Sometimes it's paperwork that mysteriously disappears. Sometimes it's medicine that somehow appears when it shouldn't exist. Sometimes it's just one man who decides that even in hell, some rules still matter. And that decision, quiet and careful and desperately dangerous, can mean the difference between 140 men dying in a frozen camp and 140 men going home. Heinrich Geiger never called himself a hero, but the men he saved did. And in the end, their opinion is the one that matters. Because he taught them something they carried home, that even in the worst circumstances, even under the worst regime, individual humans can still choose decency. It costs them. It might destroy them. But they can choose it. And sometimes that choice saves the world, one prisoner at a time.